The rain was relentless that night, hammering down on the streets of Seattle like an uninvited guest refusing to leave. It drummed on windows, soaked sidewalks, and filled the air with a damp chill that seeped into the bones of anyone unlucky enough to be outside. Ethan Carter adjusted the hood of his jacket, his shoulders hunched against the cold, as he pushed his bicycle through a dimly lit alley. The city was alive in its usual way, bright lights and muffled laughter spilling out of bars and cafes a few blocks away. But here, in the shadowed maze of backstreets, it felt like a different world. The occasional hum of passing cars echoed in the distance, but the alley itself was quiet, save for the sound of rainwater rushing into storm drains. Ethan paused beneath the flickering light of a rusted street lamp, pulling his phone out to check the next address for his delivery. His hands, chilled from the rain, trembled slightly as he scrolled through the app. It was a meager job, but it was all he had. The few dollars he earned would cover his rent and maybe keep his phone active for another month. As he prepared to mount his bike again, a sound stopped him, a faint, almost imperceptible meow cutting through the rain. Ethan froze, his pulse quickening. He scanned the alley, but nothing moved. The sound came again, softer this time, like a plea lost in the storm. Setting his bike aside, Ethan stepped cautiously toward the sound. The alley was cluttered with trash bins and piles of discarded boxes, their soggy edges caving under the weight of the rain. He followed the sound to a stack of damp cardboard near a dumpster. Kneeling down, he hesitated, unsure what he might find. "Hello," he called out, his voice uncertain. With careful hands, Ethan pushed aside the top layer of boxes. There in the shadows lay a small, trembling figure, a cat. Its gray fur was matted with dirt and rainwater, and its left paw was curled unnaturally beneath its body. The cat's golden eyes, wide with pain and fear, locked onto Ethan's. For a moment, Ethan stared, his breath caught in his chest. Those eyes, so filled with vulnerability, stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. A part of him wanted to turn away, to leave the creature to its fate. He wasn't equipped for this. His life was already a wreck. He could barely take care of himself, let alone another living thing. But the cat let out another soft meow, its body shivering violently in the cold. Ethan felt a pang of guilt twist in his stomach. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. He looked around as if expecting someone else to step in and handle the situation, but the alley was as empty as ever. With a sigh of resignation, Ethan slipped off his jacket and carefully wrapped it around the cat, cradling the fragile creature in his arms. The cat didn't resist, too weak to protest. "All right, buddy," Ethan murmured. "Let's get you out of this mess." The rain soaked through Ethan's shirt as he walked, but he barely noticed. The weight of the cat in his arms was oddly grounding, its tiny form radiating a warmth that cut through the chill. He made his way through the streets, passing bright storefronts and neon signs that seemed to mock his sodden appearance. When he finally reached his apartment building, a nondescript structure wedged between a laundromat and a corner store, Ethan was drenched to the bone. He climbed the narrow staircase to his unit, fumbling with his keys before pushing the door open. His apartment was a mess. An assortment of half-empty takeout containers, unopened mail, and discarded clothes littered the small space. The single window was streaked with rain, casting a muted glow over the room. Ethan set the cat down gently on an old blanket he found near the couch. The creature let out a weak sound of protest, but made no attempt to move. "Let's see what we're working with here," Ethan said, crouching down to get a better look. The cat's fur was tangled and filthy, and its injured paw was swollen and discolored. He winced at the sight. Grabbing his phone, Ethan searched for how to care for an injured cat and quickly realized he was in over his head. He didn't have the money for a vet, nor did he know anyone who could help. Instead, he did what he could. He fetched a bowl of lukewarm water and carefully wiped the cat's fur clean, murmuring apologies whenever it flinched. After wrapping the paw in a makeshift bandage from an old t-shirt, he set out a small plate of tuna, one of the few items in his fridge that wasn't expired. The cat sniffed at the food hesitantly before taking a tentative bite. Ethan watched, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well, at least you're eating," he said, leaning back against the couch. As the night wore on, the cat curled up on the blanket, its breathing slow and steady. Ethan found himself unable to look away. There was something oddly comforting about the little creature's presence, as if it filled a space in his apartment and in his heart that had long been empty. He leaned his head back, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. "What am I even doing?" he muttered to himself. But deep down, he knew the answer. For the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. Morning crept into Ethan's apartment through the lone window, its weak light barely penetrating the heavy rain clouds that still loomed over the city. The soft patter of rain mixed with the faint hum of traffic outside, creating a muffled soundtrack to Ethan's small, cluttered world. He stirred on the couch, where he had fallen asleep fully clothed, his legs dangling over the armrest. For a moment, he couldn't remember why he felt so restless, why there was a faint pang of responsibility nagging at the back of his mind. Then he saw the small lump of gray fur curled up on the blanket in the corner. The cat, Milo, he'd decided to call it, was still there, its bandaged paw tucked protectively under its body. Ethan sat up, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, you made it through the night," he muttered. The cat blinked at him, golden eyes watching his every move. Ethan pushed himself off the couch and shuffled to the kitchen. There wasn't much to work with. His fridge held a depressing collection of condiments and a lone can of soda, but he managed to find a half-empty box of cereal and a carton of milk that hadn't yet turned. As he poured himself a bowl, Milo let out a small, hoarse meow. Ethan glanced over his shoulder. "What? You hungry again?" The cat didn't answer, of course, but its gaze didn't waver. Sighing, Ethan opened another can of tuna and set it on the floor. Milo hobbled over, its movements slow and awkward but determined. Ethan watched as the cat ate, a strange sense of satisfaction blooming in his chest. "All right," he said, leaning against the counter. "I guess you're sticking around for a while." As the day unfolded, Ethan found himself adjusting to Milo's presence in small but noticeable ways. He cleared a corner of the apartment, piling up old blankets and towels to make a more comfortable bed for the cat. He cleaned up the takeout boxes and empty bottles that had been gathering dust on his coffee table, partly to make room for Milo, and partly because, for the first time in a long while, the mess actually bothered him. Milo, for its part, seemed to settle in quickly. Though its movements were still hindered by the injured paw, it followed Ethan around the apartment, its tail flicking back and forth with curiosity. When Ethan sat down at his desk to check for new delivery assignments, Milo jumped onto the windowsill, its golden eyes scanning the rain-slick streets below. "You're nosy, aren't you?" Ethan said, glancing up from his laptop. "Bet you were a real troublemaker out there." Milo didn't respond, but the way it tilted its head made Ethan chuckle, a rare sound that startled even himself. That afternoon, Ethan bundled up and ventured out for a few deliveries. He hated leaving Milo alone, but there wasn't much choice. The rain had eased to a light drizzle, but the streets were still slick and cold. As Ethan pedaled through the city, he found his mind drifting back to the cat, wondering if it was still curled up in the corner or if it had found a way to wreak havoc in his absence. When he returned home hours later, he was greeted by the sight of Milo sitting regally on the couch, its head held high as if it were the ruler of this small, dingy kingdom. Ethan couldn't help but grin. "Well, looks like you didn't burn the place down," he said, shrugging off his soaked jacket. Milo meowed in response, its tail curling around its body. Days turned into a week, and Ethan began to realize just how much Milo had changed the rhythm of his life. The cat became his constant companion, a quiet presence that filled the emptiness of his apartment. It wasn't just the practicalities of feeding and caring for Milo. It was the way the cat seemed to sense when Ethan was spiraling into one of his darker moods, the way it would climb onto his lap or nudge his hand with its head, forcing him to stay present. Ethan found himself talking to Milo more often than he cared to admit. "You know," he said one evening as he typed on his battered laptop, "I haven't written anything in years. Not seriously, anyway." Milo was perched on the back of the couch, its ears flicking as it listened, or at least pretended to. "There was this one story I started," Ethan continued, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, "about a boy and his dog. It was going to be my big break. But then—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. Milo let out a soft chirp, and Ethan chuckled humorlessly. "Yeah, well, life happens, huh?" But the thought lingered, and later that night, Ethan found himself opening a new document on his laptop. He stared at the blank screen for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing with doubt. But then he glanced at Milo, who was curled up on the bed, snoring softly. With a deep breath, Ethan began to type. Milo's presence also began to affect Ethan's interactions outside the apartment. On one particularly gray morning, Ethan decided to take Milo with him on a delivery run. He fashioned a makeshift carrier out of an old backpack, cutting a hole in the top so Milo could poke its head out. At first, Milo seemed unimpressed, meowing loudly as Ethan secured the straps. But as they rolled through the streets, the cat's complaints gave way to curious silence. Its head swiveled back and forth, taking in the sights and sounds of the city. When Ethan stopped to deliver a package to a small cafe, the barista behind the counter lit up at the sight of Milo. "Oh my gosh, is that your cat?" she asked, her eyes wide with delight. Yeah," Ethan said, scratching the back of his neck. "Sort of. It's a long story." "She's adorable," the barista gushed. "What's her name?" "Milo," Ethan replied, glancing down at the cat. "Well, Milo just earned you a free coffee," the barista said with a wink. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. It had been years since anyone had gone out of their way to be kind to him. "Thanks," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. As he sipped the coffee on his way back to the bike, he glanced at Milo. "Looks like you're my good luck charm now." Milo meowed, and Ethan couldn't help but laugh. By the end of the week, Ethan had come to a quiet realization. Milo wasn't just a stray he had taken in. Milo was his anchor, his reason to get out of bed in the morning, his proof that even in the darkest corners of life, there was still room for connection. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he was moving forward, even if it was just one small step at a time. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks, spilling a pale golden light over the city. Ethan noticed it as he sat on the edge of his couch, tying the laces on his worn-out sneakers. The apartment felt warmer, though perhaps that was because of the small bundle of fur stretched out lazily on the windowsill. Milo had claimed the spot as its throne, perched there for hours at a time, soaking up what little sunlight Seattle offered. Ethan couldn't help but smile as he watched the cat stretch, its tail curling like a question mark. "Living the dream, huh?" he teased. "Meanwhile, I have to go scrape together rent money." Milo meowed lazily in response, as if to say, "Your problem, not mine." Ethan grabbed his backpack, the one now permanently outfitted as Milo's travel carrier, and slung it over his shoulder. He had started bringing Milo along on his delivery routes more often, partially because he hated leaving the cat alone, but mostly because Milo had become something of a mascot. It was astonishing, really. People who wouldn't have spared Ethan a second glance before were now stopping him on the street, smiling as they asked about the cat peeking out of his backpack. The extra attention still felt strange to Ethan, but he couldn't deny it was nice. That morning, Ethan and Milo made their first stop at a bakery tucked into the corner of a quiet block. The warm, yeasty aroma wafting out the door made Ethan's stomach rumble. He hadn't eaten yet, but the delivery app had him on a tight schedule. As he approached the counter, the baker, a cheerful woman with flour dusting her hands, immediately noticed Milo. "Well, there's my favorite customer," she said, leaning over the counter to get a better look. "And I guess you brought the cat, too." Ethan smirked. Yeah, laugh it up." She grinned and reached into a basket behind the counter, pulling out a small paper bag. "I saved an extra scone for you," she said. "Blueberry. Figured you might need a proper breakfast." "Thanks," Ethan said, genuinely touched. "I'll pay you back when—" "Don't even think about it," she interrupted, waving him off. "You and Milo brighten my day every time you stop by." As Ethan left the bakery, chewing on the warm, buttery scone, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Belonging. The day continued in much the same way, with Milo drawing smiles and compliments wherever they went. At one point, a young woman in a coffee shop asked to take a picture of the cat, promising to tag Ethan in her social media post. Ethan had laughed awkwardly, unsure how to explain that he hadn't used social media in years. By the time they returned home that evening, Ethan was exhausted but content. Milo, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed. The cat leapt gracefully out of the backpack and immediately made a beeline for its food bowl. Ethan collapsed onto the couch, running a hand through his damp hair. He stared at the ceiling for a while, letting the day's events wash over him. It was strange how quickly Milo had become the center of his world. Before Milo, Ethan had moved through life like a ghost, invisible and unremarkable. But now, people were starting to notice him, not because of anything he had done, but because of the small, scrappy creature he had taken in. "Guess you're a star now," Ethan said, glancing at Milo, who was busy cleaning its paw. "Maybe I should hire you as my PR agent." Milo responded with a soft chirp, and Ethan chuckled. That night, as Ethan sat at his desk with his laptop open, he found himself staring at the blank document on the screen. He had been meaning to write, really write, for weeks now, but every time he tried, doubt crept in and paralyzed him. He glanced over at Milo, who had jumped onto the desk and was now batting lazily at a pen. The cat's carefree demeanor was oddly reassuring, as if it were reminding him not to take himself so seriously. Ethan took a deep breath and started typing. The words came slowly at first, hesitant and uncertain, but they came. He didn't know exactly what he was writing, part memoir, part fiction, but it felt good to let the words flow again. By the time he stopped, the clock read 2:17 a.m. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. Milo had fallen asleep on the desk, curled into a tight ball next to his notebook. "Looks like we both had a productive night," Ethan murmured. The following week brought a mix of progress and challenges. On one hand, Ethan felt more alive than he had in years. His daily routines were less monotonous, his interactions with people more meaningful. On the other hand, he couldn't ignore the practical realities pressing down on him. His rent was due in 2 weeks, and his delivery gigs barely covered the essentials. Every night, he calculated and recalculated his expenses, trying to figure out how to make it all work. One evening, as Ethan was sorting through his bills, there was a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found his neighbor, Mr. Larson, standing there with a disapproving look. The elderly man lived in the unit next door and had a reputation for being overly fussy about noise and cleanliness. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," Larson said, his tone clipped. "I couldn't help but notice you've been keeping a cat in your apartment." Ethan tensed. "Yeah, that's Milo. Is there a problem?" Larson frowned. "The lease agreement clearly states no pets are allowed in this building. I've tolerated it so far, but the smell is becoming an issue." Ethan felt a surge of anger bubble up, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Milo doesn't cause any problems," he said. "I clean up after him, and he's quiet." "Be that as it may," Larson replied, "rules are rules. If you don't find a solution soon, I'll have to notify the landlord." As Larson walked away, Ethan shut the door with more force than necessary. Milo, sensing his frustration, padded over and rubbed against his leg. Ethan sighed, kneeling down to scratch behind the cat's ears. "What are we going to do, buddy?" Milo purred softly, as if to say, "We'll figure it out." That night, as Ethan lay awake in bed, his mind raced with worst-case scenarios. He couldn't lose Milo, not after everything they'd been through. But the reality of their situation was hard to ignore. For the first time in weeks, doubt crept back in, threatening to undo the fragile sense of stability Ethan had built. But then Milo jumped onto the bed and curled up beside him, pressing its warm body against his side. Ethan felt his breathing slow, the weight in his chest easing slightly. "We'll figure it out," he whispered, echoing the thought he imagined Milo had earlier. And deep down, he believed it. The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of rain tapping softly against the window. Milo was already awake, sitting on the windowsill as usual, watching the gray world outside with quiet curiosity. Ethan sighed as he sat up, the weight of Mr. Larson's words still heavy on his mind. He couldn't afford to lose this apartment, as small and run down as it was. But he also couldn't imagine parting with Milo. The thought of handing the cat over to a shelter, or worse, abandoning it altogether, made his stomach churn. "You're too much trouble, you know that?" Ethan said, half joking as he padded over to the kitchen. Milo turned its head, blinking at him with an expression Ethan could only describe as indignant. Yeah, I know. You're perfect. It's the world that's the problem." The day passed in a blur of deliveries and brooding thoughts. Ethan tried to focus on work, but his mind kept circling back to the same questions. How long could he keep this up? What would happen if Mr. Larson actually reported him? And Most pressing of all, what kind of person would he be if he let Milo go? By the time Ethan finished his last delivery and returned home, the rain had picked up again, drenching the city in a steady downpour. He opened the apartment door to find Milo waiting for him, as usual. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said, setting his bag down. "Miss me?" Milo meowed in response, weaving between Ethan's legs. Ethan grabbed a towel and crouched down to dry Milo's fur, which had gotten damp from sitting near the drafty window. As he worked, he felt the knot of anxiety in his chest loosen, if only slightly. "Maybe I'm overthinking this," Ethan muttered. "Maybe Larson will forget about it and we'll be fine." But even as he said the words, he knew he didn't believe them. A few days later, Ethan's worst fears began to materialize. He came home from a particularly long day of deliveries to find a letter taped to his door. His stomach sank as he tore it open, scanning the neatly typed words. "Dear Mr. Carter, it has come to our attention that you are in violation of the building's no pet policy. Please make arrangements to remove the animal from the premises within the next 7 days. Failure to comply will result in further action up to and including termination of your lease. Sincerely, Property Management." Ethan stared at the letter, his hands trembling. 7 days. That was all the time he had to figure out a solution. Inside, Milo greeted him with a cheerful meow, completely unaware of the turmoil unfolding around it. Ethan sank onto the couch, the letter crumpled in his fist. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked aloud, his voice breaking. "I can't lose you." Milo jumped onto the couch and pressed its head against Ethan's arm, purring softly. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. That night, Ethan barely slept. He spent hours researching options online, looking up pet-friendly housing and shelters, but nothing seemed viable. The few apartments he found were either far out of his price range or located on the outskirts of the city, too far for his delivery routes. By morning, he felt more lost than ever. As he sipped his coffee, staring blankly at the rain-streaked window, an idea began to form in the back of his mind. It wasn't a good idea. In fact, it was probably one of the worst ideas he'd ever had, but it was all he could think of. "What if," he began, glancing at Milo, who was curled up on the couch. "What if I took you to the shelter, just for a little while, until I figure things out?" The thought made his chest ache, but it seemed like the only option. At least Milo would be safe, cared for, and out of harm's way. Later that day, Ethan packed a small bag for Milo, just a few essentials, like food, a blanket, and the old collar he had found at a thrift store. Milo watched him with its usual curiosity, completely oblivious to what was happening. "I'm sorry, buddy," Ethan said, his voice thick. "I'm so sorry." As he zipped up the bag, he felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He wiped them away angrily, refusing to let himself fall apart. He had to do this. For Milo. The shelter was a small, nondescript building tucked away on a quiet street. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet fur. A receptionist greeted Ethan with a warm smile, but he could barely meet her eyes. I'm here to drop off a cat," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The receptionist nodded and handed him a form to fill out. Ethan scribbled his answers mechanically, each stroke of the pen feeling like a betrayal. When the time came to hand Milo over, Ethan hesitated. Milo was nestled in his arms, purring softly, completely unaware of what was happening. "Are you sure about this?" the receptionist asked gently. Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to say no, to scoop Milo up and walk out the door, but instead he nodded. "Yeah," he said hoarsely. "I'm sure." The walk back to his apartment was the longest of Ethan's life. The city felt colder, lonelier, without Milo at his side. He kept expecting to hear the cat's soft meow or feel its warm presence against his leg, but all he heard was the rain and the hollow sound of his own footsteps. When he got home, the apartment felt unbearably empty. Milo's bed was still in the corner, and the bowl of food Ethan had left out that morning sat untouched. Ethan sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. He had done the right thing. He was sure of that. But then why did it feel like he had just lost the only thing that made his life worth living? The next few days passed in a haze. Ethan went through the motions of work and daily life, but everything felt muted, like he was sleepwalking through his own existence. Then, one evening, there was a knock at his door. When he opened it, he was met with a sight that made his heart stop. There, standing in the rain, was Milo. The cat's fur was soaked, its bandaged paw muddy, but its eyes shone with determination. "Milo?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. Milo let out a loud, indignant meow, as if to say, "How dare you leave me?" Ethan scooped the cat into his arms, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. "I'll never leave you again. I promise." As he held Milo close, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time, he realized that no matter how difficult life became, he and Milo could face it together. Ethan sat on the floor of his apartment, holding Milo close as the rain hammered against the window. The cat's fur was damp and messy, and its bandaged paw looked worse for wear, but Milo purred contentedly in his arms, as if nothing in the world could disturb its peace. Ethan, on the other hand, was far from calm. His mind raced with questions. How had Milo found its way back? Had it escaped the shelter, or had someone else let it go? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do now? As much as Ethan wanted to celebrate Milo's return, the reality of their situation loomed over him like a storm cloud. The letter from the landlord still sat on the counter, a stark reminder of the ticking clock. Ethan sighed and set Milo down gently on the couch. The cat stretched and curled up as if it had never left, its golden eyes following Ethan as he paced the room. "All right," Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. "If you're not giving up, then I won't either." The next morning, Ethan got to work. He started by calling the shelter, explaining what had happened, and asking if Milo had officially been adopted yet. "No, Milo hadn't been processed into the system yet," the receptionist explained. "It's rare for a cat to find its way back to its owner like that, though, almost like it was meant to be." Ethan smiled at the thought. Meant to be. The idea warmed him, even as he prepared for the challenges ahead. Next, he began searching for alternatives. He spent hours combing through listings for pet-friendly apartments, even though most of them were far beyond his budget. He called shelters and animal welfare organizations, asking if there were any programs that could help him keep Milo while resolving his housing issue. The answers were all the same: polite sympathy, but no real solutions. By the end of the day, Ethan was drained, and his optimism was fading. He collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling, as Milo jumped onto his chest and curled up there, purring softly. "You're not making this easy, are you?" Ethan murmured, stroking the cat's head. Milo nuzzled against him, its steady purring a reminder of why Ethan was fighting so hard in the first place. Over the next few days, Ethan's determination began to attract attention. During one of his delivery runs, he stopped by the bakery where the friendly baker, Mrs. Jensen, greeted him with her usual enthusiasm. "You look exhausted," she said, handing him a steaming cup of coffee on the house. "Everything all right?" Ethan hesitated. He hadn't told anyone about his housing problem yet, partly because he didn't want pity, and partly because he wasn't sure what they could do to help. But Mrs. Jensen's warm, motherly demeanor made it hard to keep the truth to himself. "It's complicated," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "My landlord says I can't keep Milo in the apartment. I've got about a week to figure something out, or we're both out on the street." Mrs. Jensen frowned, her hands resting on her flour-dusted hips. "That's ridiculous. Milo's the best thing to happen to this neighborhood. Everybody loves that cat." Ethan chuckled weakly. "Unfortunately, the landlord doesn't see it that way." "Well, you're not dealing with this alone," she said firmly. "Let me make some calls. I know a few people who might be able to help." Ethan blinked, surprised by her generosity. "You do that?" "Of course," she said, waving him off. "Milo's part of the community now, and so are you." The next morning, Ethan woke to find a message from Mrs. Jensen on his phone. "I spoke to a friend who works for a local animal rescue organization. She thinks they might be able to help with temporary housing or legal advice for your situation. Call me when you're free." Ethan felt a surge of hope. He immediately called Mrs. Jensen, who connected him with her friend, a woman named Karen, who ran a nonprofit dedicated to helping low-income families keep their pets. Karen was kind and understanding, and she listened patiently as Ethan explained his predicament. "Unfortunately, I can't change your landlord's rules," she said, her voice sympathetic. "But I can offer temporary foster care for Milo while you look for a new place. And if you're open to it, we might be able to start a fundraiser to help cover the costs of moving." Ethan hesitated. The idea of handing Milo over, even temporarily, made his stomach churn. But Karen's offer was the first real solution he'd heard, and he knew he couldn't afford to dismiss it outright. "Let me think about it," he said finally. "But thank you, really." Later that day, Ethan sat in the park with Milo, watching as the cat explored the grass and sniffed at the flowers. It was a rare sunny afternoon, and the warmth of the sun on his face reminded Ethan of simpler times, before his life had unraveled. As he watched Milo bat playfully at a fallen leaf, he couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. Just a few weeks ago, he had been a shell of a man, going through the motions of a life he had long since given up on. Now, he was fighting for something, for someone who had given him a reason to hope again. "You're stubborn? You know that?" Ethan said, smiling as Milo trotted back to him, leaf in tow. "But I guess that's what I like about you." Milo jumped onto the bench beside him, curling up against his side. Ethan stared out at the horizon, his mind racing with possibilities. Karen's suggestion of a fundraiser had seemed daunting at first, but maybe it was worth a shot. He could share Milo's story, how the cat had found its way back to him, how it had given him a reason to keep going. Maybe people would care. Maybe they'd help. Ethan pulled out his phone and opened the social media account he hadn't touched in years. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he began typing. "This is Milo. I found him in an alley a few weeks ago, injured and alone. I thought I was helping him, but the truth is, he's the one who saved me." By the time he finished, his post was longer than he'd intended, filled with raw, unfiltered emotion. He hesitated before hitting post, but Milo's golden eyes seemed to urge him on. "All right," he said, pressing the button. "Let's see what happens." That night, as Ethan lay in bed with Milo curled up at his feet, his phone buzzed with a notification. Then another. And another. When he picked it up, his heart skipped a beat. His post had gone viral. Comments flooded in from strangers offering words of encouragement, sharing their own stories of how animals had changed their lives. More importantly, the fundraiser link Karen had helped him set up was gaining traction. For the first time in weeks, Ethan allowed himself to hope. The morning after Ethan's post went viral, he woke to the buzz of his phone vibrating relentlessly on the nightstand. For a brief moment, he thought it might be another overdue bill or a reminder from the delivery app. But when he picked it up, his screen was flooded with notifications. Hundreds of comments and messages from strangers lit up his phone. "Milo is such a fighter. Thank you for sharing your story. Keep going. You're not alone." This brought tears to my eyes. "I've been where you are, and I know how much having someone, human or not, can save you. Sending love." Even more astonishing were the donations. The fundraiser link Karen had helped him set up showed that over $3,000 had already been raised. Ethan's heart swelled as he scrolled through the list of donors, many of whom had left kind words of encouragement alongside their contributions. He sat on the edge of the bed, Milo sprawled out beside him, completely unaware of the uproar it had caused online. "Well," Ethan said, scratching behind the cat's ears, "I guess you're famous now." Milo yawned and stretched lazily, as if to say, "I've always been famous. You're just catching up." The next few days were a whirlwind. Ethan spent hours responding to messages and thanking donors, each new interaction making him feel less alone than he had in years. Karen's team at the rescue organization helped amplify the fundraiser, sharing it with their own network and reaching out to local news outlets. By the end of the week, the total donations had doubled, then tripled. A local news station even reached out, asking if Ethan would be willing to do a short interview about Milo and their journey together. At first, Ethan hesitated. The idea of putting himself out there, of sharing his struggles so openly, made his stomach twist with anxiety. But when he thought about how much Milo had already done for him, he realized this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless others who might see their story and feel inspired to keep fighting, just as he had. The interview took place in a small park near Ethan's apartment, with Milo sitting proudly on a bench beside him. The reporter, a warm and curious woman named Lisa, asked him about everything: how he had found Milo, how the cat had changed his life, and what he hoped to achieve with the fundraiser. Ethan spoke honestly, though his voice wavered at times. I was lost before I found Milo, he admitted, glancing down at the cat, who was busy pawing at a leaf. I didn't think I had much left to fight for, but when I saw him, hurt, abandoned, I realized I couldn't just walk away. And in taking care of him, I found a reason to start taking care of myself again. Lisa smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. And now the community is stepping up to help you both. How does that feel? It's overwhelming, Ethan said, his throat tightening. In a good way. I never thought so many people would care. It's given me hope, not just for me and Milo, but for the idea that we're all capable of helping each other, even in small ways. The interview aired that evening, and the response was immediate. Ethan's fundraiser surged past its initial goal, and people from all over the city began reaching out to offer support. Some donated supplies like food and toys for Milo. Others shared tips on finding affordable housing or offered to connect him with local advocates who could help. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like the weight of the world wasn't solely on his shoulders. But not everyone was supportive. A few days after the interview aired, Ethan received an anonymous note slipped under his door. It was scrawled in messy handwriting, but its message was clear. Stop begging for handouts. You made your bed, now lie in it. Ethan stared at the note, his chest tightening with a mix of anger and shame. He had known there would be critics, but the words still cut deep. Don't let it get to you, Karen told him when he showed her the note later that day. There will always be people who judge, no matter what you do. But for every one of them, there are 100 others rooting for you. Ethan nodded, though the doubt lingered in the back of his mind. The turning point came one rainy afternoon when Ethan received a call from a woman named Dana, who introduced herself as a lawyer specializing in tenant advocacy. I saw your story on the news, she said. I work with a nonprofit that helps tenants fight unfair housing policies. If you're interested, we could look into your landlord's no-pet rule and see if there's any legal recourse. Ethan hesitated. The idea of going up against his landlord seemed daunting, but the thought of giving up Milo was even worse. What would that involve? He asked. It depends, Dana said. But at the very least, we could argue that Milo provides emotional support, which might exempt you from the no-pet policy under federal housing laws. Ethan's stomach flipped. Emotional support? He had never thought about Milo in those terms before, but the more he considered it, the more it made sense. Milo wasn't just a pet, he was the reason Ethan had started to rebuild his life. Over the next week, Ethan worked closely with Dana and her team to gather evidence. He provided documentation of his struggles with anxiety and depression, as well as a letter from Karen attesting to the positive impact Milo had on his mental health. The process was stressful, but Ethan refused to give up. Every time doubt crept in, he looked at Milo, who seemed blissfully unaware of the battle being fought on his behalf. You're worth it, Ethan whispered one night as Milo curled up beside him. Whatever it takes, you're worth it. Finally, the day came for Ethan to meet with his landlord and present his case. Dana accompanied him, her calm professionalism a steadying presence as they entered the small, sterile office. The landlord, a stern man in his 50s, listened quietly as Dana laid out their argument. She spoke with confidence, citing federal housing laws and emphasizing the emotional support Milo provided. When she finished, the landlord leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I'll admit, he said slowly, this is a unique situation, but after reviewing the evidence, I'm willing to make an exception. Milo can stay, as long as you keep up with rent and ensure he doesn't disturb the neighbors. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. You mean it? The landlord nodded. Consider this a one-time courtesy. Don't make me regret it. When Ethan and Dana left the office, he felt like he could finally breathe again. Thank you, he said, turning to her. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You already have, Dana said with a smile, by showing everyone what a difference one little cat can make. That evening, Ethan sat on the couch with Milo in his lap, a sense of peace settling over him for the first time in weeks. He had fought for Milo, and in doing so, he had rediscovered his own strength. As the rain tapped softly against the window, Ethan opened his laptop and began to write again. This time, he wasn't just writing for himself. He was writing for everyone who had supported him, for everyone who had ever felt like giving up, and for everyone who might someday find their own reason to hope. And as Milo purred softly in his lap, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. The days that followed Ethan's victory with the landlord felt like stepping into a new world. For the first time in years, he didn't wake up with the weight of dread pressing down on his chest. Milo, ever the early riser, would nudge him awake with soft headbutts before curling up on his chest, purring loudly. Ethan had found stability, but more than that, he had found hope. One morning, as Ethan scrolled through his phone while sipping his coffee, he came across a notification he hadn't expected. A popular online blog had featured his story, sharing the video of his interview and highlighting how the community had rallied behind him and Milo. From alley cat to emotional lifesaver, the headline read. Ethan tapped on the link, his heart pounding as he read the article. It described his journey in detail, from finding Milo injured in the rain to the battle with his landlord and how he had turned his life around with Milo's help. The article ended with a call to action, encouraging readers to support local rescue organizations and be more compassionate toward people and their pets. By the time Ethan finished reading, the post already had hundreds of comments. People shared their own stories of pets who had saved them, offering heartfelt thanks for Ethan's vulnerability. Ethan sat back, his mind racing. He had written countless words in his life, but none had ever resonated with people the way this story had. Milo leapt onto the table, startling him out of his thoughts. The cat stared at him expectantly, as if saying, "Well, what are you going to do with this?" Ethan laughed softly, running a hand through Milo's fur. "You're right," he said. "We've got more work to do." That afternoon, Ethan reached out to Karen. "I want to give back," he said, his voice steady with determination. "People helped me when I thought I was out of options. I want to do the same for others." Karen was thrilled. "I had a feeling you'd say that. We've been working on a new campaign to raise awareness for emotional support animals. Would you and Milo be interested in being the face of it?" "Absolutely," Ethan replied, without hesitation. The campaign launched a few weeks later, featuring photos of Ethan and Milo alongside stories from others who had found healing through their pets. Ethan participated in interviews, spoke at events, and even helped organize fundraisers for the rescue organization. At first, stepping into the spotlight felt daunting, but with Milo by his side, often perched confidently on his shoulder or curled up in his lap, Ethan found himself embracing the role. One evening, after a particularly successful event, Ethan returned home to find a package waiting for him at his door. Inside was a sleek new laptop, accompanied by a note. To Ethan, your story reminds us that there's always hope, even in the darkest times. Keep writing. We can't wait to see what you'll create next. A grateful supporter. Ethan stared at the laptop in disbelief, his chest tightening with emotion. He had always dreamed of being a writer, but somewhere along the way, that dream had been buried under the weight of failure and self-doubt. Now, with Milo curled up beside him and the new laptop glowing softly in the dim light of the apartment, Ethan felt that dream stir to life again. Over the next few months, Ethan poured himself into his writing. Inspired by his journey with Milo, he began working on a memoir, part personal reflection, part love letter to the stray cat who had saved him. He worked tirelessly, often losing track of time as the words flowed onto the page. Milo, ever the loyal companion, stayed close, occasionally batting at the keys or curling up beside the laptop as if to supervise. By the time Ethan finished the manuscript, he felt lighter, freer, as if he had finally let go of the burden he had been carrying for so long. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan sat in the park where he had once done the interview that changed his life. This time, he wasn't there for an interview or a fundraiser. He was there to celebrate. His memoir, titled Milo, the Cat Who Saved Me, had been picked up by a local publisher. The first print run was modest, but the response was overwhelming. Reviews poured in from readers who connected with Ethan's honesty and resilience. Ethan sat on the bench, watching as Milo chased a stray leaf across the grass. In his hands was a copy of the book, the cover adorned with a simple yet striking photo of Milo perched on the windowsill, staring out at the world. A group of children ran past, laughing and pointing at Milo. Their parents waved at Ethan, recognizing him from the events and news articles. For the first time in years, Ethan felt truly at peace. That evening, as he and Milo settled in for the night, Ethan reflected on how far they had come. From the dark, rainy alley where they first met to this new chapter filled with possibility, it had been a journey of struggle, growth, and unexpected joy. He ran a hand through Milo's fur, smiling as the cat purred contentedly beside him. "We did it, buddy," he said softly. "And this is just the beginning." Milo opened one eye, meowed softly, and curled closer. Ethan turned off the light, his heart full of gratitude for the small but mighty companion who had changed his life in ways he never could have imagined. The air was crisp with the first signs of winter as Ethan stood at the entrance of a brightly lit bookstore in downtown Seattle. Tonight was the launch event for his memoir, Milo, the Cat Who Saved Me. The glass windows of the shop displayed stacks of his book, the cover featuring Milo perched on the windowsill with the soft glow of Seattle's city lights behind him. Inside, a modest crowd had gathered, friends, strangers, and supporters who had followed Ethan's journey from the beginning. Ethan adjusted the collar of his shirt, his nerves threatening to get the better of him. He had never been one for public speaking, but tonight felt different. "Ready?" Karen asked, appearing beside him with an encouraging smile. Ethan glanced at Milo, who was nestled comfortably in his carrier, his golden eyes scanning the room. If the cat was nervous, it didn't show. "As ready as I'll ever be," Ethan said, taking a deep breath. The event began with Karen introducing Ethan and Milo, sharing a brief overview of their story and the impact it had on the community. Ethan listened from the side, his palms sweaty as he rehearsed his speech in his mind. When Karen called him up, the room erupted into applause. Ethan stepped forward, holding Milo's carrier close as he faced the crowd. "Hi, everyone," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "Thank you for being here tonight. I'm still getting used to all of this." The audience chuckled warmly, easing some of his nerves. "I've spent most of my life believing that I wasn't good enough, that my failures defined me. But then I met Milo, and everything changed. I thought I was rescuing him, but the truth is, he rescued me." Ethan paused, his throat tightening. Milo let out a soft meow, as if urging him to continue. "This book isn't just about me and Milo," Ethan said, his voice steadier now. "It's about everyone who has ever felt lost, everyone who has ever needed a second chance. It's about finding hope in the most unexpected places and realizing that we're stronger together." The room was silent for a moment before the applause came, loud and heartfelt. Ethan's chest swelled with gratitude as he took his seat at the signing table, Milo curling up beside him. The book signing lasted for hours, with people lining up to meet Ethan and Milo. Some brought their own pets, eager to share their stories of how animals had changed their lives. "I've been following your story since the beginning," one woman said, clutching her copy of the book. "My dog helped me through cancer treatment. Reading about you and Milo reminded me that we're never truly alone." Ethan listened intently to each story, his heart swelling with a sense of connection he hadn't felt in years. Milo, ever the star, accepted head scratches and treats from fans with regal indifference. By the end of the night, Ethan was exhausted but deeply fulfilled. As he packed up his things, Karen approached him, holding a clipboard. "You did great tonight," she said. "And by the way, the sales from the book are already exceeding expectations. A portion of the proceeds will go to our rescue organization, just like we planned." "That's amazing," Ethan said, his smile widening. Karen hesitated for a moment before continuing. "We've also been thinking about starting a new initiative, something focused on pairing rescue animals with people in need of emotional support. And we were hoping you and Milo might want to be involved." Ethan blinked, surprised. "Like a therapy program?" "Exactly," Karen said. "You've seen firsthand how much of a difference it can make. We think your story could inspire others to open their hearts to the possibility." Ethan glanced down at Milo, who was now half asleep in his carrier. The idea of helping others the way Milo had helped him filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "I'd love to," he said. In the weeks that followed, Ethan threw himself into the new project. He worked closely with Karen's team, helping to develop outreach programs and organize events. He also began visiting shelters and speaking to groups about the healing power of pets, often bringing Milo along as a living example. At one event, a young man approached Ethan after his talk, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket. "Hey," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to say thanks. Your story, it's kind of what I needed to hear right now." Ethan smiled warmly. "I'm glad it helped. Do you have a pet?" The man shook his head. "No, but I've been thinking about it. I've been going through some stuff, and I don't know. I guess I always thought I didn't deserve something like that." Ethan's chest tightened with empathy. "I used to think that too," he said. "But let me tell you something. Everyone deserves a second chance. You don't have to go through it alone." The man nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thanks," he said softly. As Ethan's work with the rescue organization grew, so did his audience. Invitations poured in from schools, community centers, and even corporate offices, all eager to hear his story. Through it all, Milo remained his constant companion, a symbol of resilience and hope. Whether curled up on stage during a speech or perched on Ethan's shoulder during a photo shoot, the cat seemed to thrive in the spotlight, its quiet presence bringing comfort to everyone it met. Ethan's memoir continued to sell, and with the proceeds, he was finally able to move into a larger, pet-friendly apartment. The new space was modest but bright, with plenty of windows for Milo to lounge by. One night, as Ethan sat at his desk writing a letter of thanks to his supporters, he glanced at Milo, who was snoozing peacefully on a nearby chair. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "Do you realize what we've done? We've helped people, real people, just by being ourselves." Milo opened one eye, let out a soft meow, and promptly went back to sleep. Ethan chuckled, turning back to his letter. As he wrote, he realized that the fear and self-doubt that had once defined him were no longer there. In their place was a quiet confidence, born not from perfection, but from the knowledge that he had faced his struggles head-on and survived. And as he signed his name at the bottom of the letter, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he and Milo had not only changed their own lives, but had also become part of something much bigger, a community of hope. The winter air was crisp and sharp as Ethan stood outside a community center on the outskirts of Seattle. Snow flurries danced in the cold breeze, settling lightly on his jacket. Inside, the chatter of voices and the occasional laughter of children filled the space. It was the final event of the year for the rescue organization, a holiday gathering for families and individuals who had adopted rescue animals. Ethan glanced down at Milo, who sat proudly in his custom carrier, wrapped in a festive red scarf that Karen had insisted he wear. The cat gave him an unimpressed look, but Ethan could tell Milo was enjoying the attention. "You're the star today," Ethan said, scratching behind Milo's ears. "Not that you aren't every day." Milo purred softly, his golden eyes flicking toward the open door of the center. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the chill outside. Tables were set up with holiday decorations, snacks, and photos of pets that had been rescued and adopted throughout the year. Families mingled with volunteers, their pets trotting happily by their sides. Ethan took a moment to take it all in. He spotted Karen across the room, chatting animatedly with a young girl holding a small black kitten. Nearby, a group of children were taking turns petting a golden retriever with a wagging tail. "Ethan, over here." Karen waved him over, her face lighting up when she saw Milo. As Ethan approached, the little girl gasped, her eyes widening at the sight of Milo. "Is that Milo?" she whispered, clutching the kitten tightly. Ethan knelt down so the girl could see Milo more closely. "This is Milo," he said with a smile. "Want to say hi?" The girl nodded, and Ethan unzipped the carrier just enough for Milo to peek out. Milo, ever the professional, meowed softly and allowed the girl to gently stroke his fur. "He's even more handsome in real life," the girl said, her voice full of awe. Karen chuckled. "That's what everyone says." Ethan stayed by Karen's side for a while, answering questions from curious attendees and sharing stories about Milo. Each person he spoke to seemed to carry their own version of the same story, how an animal had saved them as much as they had saved the animal. It was a reminder that Ethan's journey with Milo wasn't unique, but it was part of something universal, the healing power of connection, even in its simplest form. Later that evening, as the event wound down, Ethan found himself outside in the snow-covered courtyard. The noise of the gathering had faded into a gentle hum behind him. Milo sat on a bench beside him, bundled in his scarf and staring up at the sky. Ethan followed the cat's gaze. The stars were faint but visible, twinkling softly above the city lights. "You've brought me a long way, buddy," Ethan said quietly. "I didn't think I'd ever make it here." Milo turned to look at him, his golden eyes filled with an expression Ethan couldn't quite describe. "I was so close to giving up," Ethan continued. "But you showed me that there's always something worth fighting for, even when it doesn't seem like it." Milo let out a soft chirp, as if agreeing. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. It was a letter he had written to himself, something Karen had suggested during one of their early conversations about the therapy program. Inside were the words he had struggled to believe for so long. "You are enough. You have always been enough." Ethan unfolded the letter, reading it again in the pale light of the courtyard. This time, the words didn't feel like a distant hope. They felt real, true. He glanced at Milo, who was now dozing peacefully on the bench. "We've got a lot more to do," he said softly, "but I think we're going to be okay." In the weeks that followed, Ethan and Milo continued their work with the rescue organization, helping to connect people with animals in need. Ethan's story gained even more traction, and invitations began pouring in from across the country. Schools, community centers, and even national conferences wanted him to speak about his journey and the bond he shared with Milo. Though the thought of traveling intimidated him, Ethan knew it was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. "Looks like we're hitting the road, buddy," he told Milo one morning as he packed a small suitcase. "You ready for your big tour?" Milo, sitting atop the suitcase, blinked lazily at him. "I'll take that as a yes." Their first stop was a small town in Oregon, where a local shelter had invited Ethan to speak at a fundraiser. The turnout was overwhelming. People of all ages filled the room, many clutching copies of Ethan's memoir or photos of their own pets. Ethan stood at the front of the room, Milo perched on his shoulder, and shared his story once again. Each time he told it, it felt a little easier, a little more natural. He had spent so much of his life hiding his struggles, but now he saw the value in sharing them. After the event, a young boy approached him, holding a leash attached to a shaggy brown dog. "This is Max," the boy said, his voice shy. "We adopted him last month. He was scared at first, but now he's my best friend." Ethan knelt down to pet Max, who wagged his tail enthusiastically. "Looks like you're doing a great job taking care of him," he said. The boy grinned. "He's taking care of me too." Ethan smiled, feeling a deep sense of connection. It was moments like this that reminded him why he and Milo were doing what they did. Months turned into a year, and Ethan's life became a tapestry of new experiences and connections. He and Milo traveled from city to city, sharing their story and building a network of people who believed in the power of second chances. Through it all, Milo remained his constant companion, a steady presence in a world that could often feel overwhelming. One evening, as they sat together in yet another hotel room, Ethan opened his laptop and began typing the first words of his next book. This is a story about hope, about resilience, and about how sometimes the smallest things can save us in the biggest ways. Milo stretched out beside him, his soft purring filling the quiet room. Ethan smiled, his fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. And as the stars twinkled outside the window, Ethan knew that he and Milo were exactly where they were meant to be.